Good morning, Psychology 200. So this week we move on to week 6. Week 6 is on experimental research. So this is actually one of the more interesting chapters. And again, you can use this chapter specifically as a method section if it can be useful, right? As a method section to your research proposal. But there are other types of methods that we are going to go over from this point forward. So this might not be a method that you may use for your project, but it is one definitely to consider. Okay, so not wasting any time, let's get into our lecture. So again, we are going over chapter 6, experimental research, okay? As usual, there are some learning objectives that I do suggest, highly suggest, that you revisit at the end of completing all your tasks for the week. So once you have read, once you have watched a lecture, once you have completed any kind of like discussion board or activities, and there are, I believe, about 2 types of assignment, please revisit the learning objectives. You can find these learning objectives, of course, here, but you can also find them on Blackboard in a more concise fashion, okay? So I do want to start off, before we get into what an experiment is, I do want to start off with just a little section from your textbook, okay? So in the late 1960s, social psychologists John Darley and Bibb Latané proposed their idea of the diffusion of responsibility. The more witnesses there are to an accident or a crime, the less likely any of them is to actually help the victim. They also tested this idea with a famous experiment in which they exposed participants to a fake emergency, a Confederate pretending to have a seizure, and manipulated the number of people the participants thought were actually present. This study confirmed that thinking more people were present actually caused participants to be less likely to help, okay? And there are plenty of real life scenarios in which this actually does occur. So for any of you who have ever been told by your family, if you're specifically a woman, right? If you're ever in a situation where you feel threatened by a man, specifically like on the verge of sexual assault or the extreme, right? Don't yell rape, but yell fire, because people are less likely to help in that kind of scenario. And that actually is based off of an incident that happened in Boston a couple decades ago, in which everyone was awake in this specific area, but nobody called help, called 911 or called for help, okay? But going back to John Darley and Bibb Latané's study, this is an example of an experiment, okay? So what is an experiment? An experiment is a type of empirical study in which an independent variable is manipulated and a dependent variable is measured while extraneous variables are controlled. Specifically, our book defines an experiment as a type of empirical study specifically designed to answer the question of whether there is a causal relationship between 2 variables. Those 2 variables are an independent variable and a dependent variable. The independent variable is a variable in a study conceptualized as a cause of the dependent variable, and the dependent variable is a variable in the study that is conceptualized as an effect of the independent variable, okay? Experiments have 2 fundamental features. The first feature is that the researcher manipulates the independent variable, okay? And the second fundamental feature of an experiment is that the researcher controls or holds constant variables other than the independent and dependent variable, okay? The researchers manipulate the independent variable by systematically changing its levels and control other variables by holding them constant. Internal validity and external validity. So just a side note, some of these terms, most of these terms at the beginning of section 1 in chapter 6 sound familiar because we went over an overview, okay, in chapter 1 and in chapter 2. So internal validity. Internal validity is the extent to which the design of a study supports the conclusion that differences in the independent variable cause any observed differences in the dependent variable, okay? External validity. External validity is the extent to which the results of a study can be generalized to people and situations beyond those actually being studied. And then a field experiment, again, this should be reviewed, is an experiment that is conducted outside of a laboratory. But going back to internal validity, keep that in mind, okay? Internal validity is the extent to which the design of a study supports the conclusion that changes in the independent variable caused any observed differences in the dependent variable, okay? Keep this in mind because we're going to talk about manipulation. Manipulation of the independent variable, okay? To manipulate an independent variable means to change its level systematically so that different groups of participants are exposed to different levels of that variable. Or the same group of participants is exposed to different levels at different times. The different levels of the independent variable are referred to as conditions. And researchers often give the conditions short descriptive names to make it easy to talk and to write about. The manipulation of an independent variable must involve the active intervention of the researcher. Comparing groups of people who differ on the independent variable before the study begins is not the same as manipulating that variable. It is important because groups that already differ in one way at the beginning of a study are likely to differ in other ways too. In many experiments, the independent variable is a construct that can only be manipulated indirectly. Researchers often include a manipulation check in their procedure, okay? What is a manipulation check? A manipulation check is a separate measure of the construct the researcher is trying to manipulate. For example, researchers trying to manipulate participants' stress levels might give them a paper and a pencil stress questionnaire or take their blood pressure, perhaps right after the manipulation or at the end of the procedure to verify that they successfully manipulated this variable. Manipulation checks are especially important in the event that there is no effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable. An extraneous variable is anything that varies in the context of a study other than the independent and the dependent variables. Extraneous variables pose a problem because they can make it difficult to separate the effect of the independent variable from the effect of the extraneous variables. This is why it is important to control them or hold them constant, okay? So how extraneous variables make it difficult to detect the effect of the independent variable? Extraneous variables make it difficult to detect the effect of the independent variable in two ways. The first way is simply by adding variability or noise to the data. For this, we are going to shortly refer to table 6.1, and I'll show you how. And the second way is by becoming confounding variables, which are extraneous variables that differ on average across conditions. Because they differ across conditions, just like the independent variable, confounding variables provide an alternative explanation for any observed difference in the dependent variable. okay? So let's look at some of these figures that are in our textbook, okay? So table 6.1, this is the noisy data. You can find this in your textbook on page 100, okay? So one reason researchers try to control extraneous variables is so that their data look more like this idealized noiseless data, okay? Happy mood, sad mood, okay? It makes it easier. It makes the effect of the independent variable easier to detect, obviously, okay? So pause, take a look at this. Okay. Figure 6.1, the hypothetical results from a study on the effect of mood. You can actually find this figure on page 102. And again, you can pause right here, okay? So figure 6.1 shows the results of a hypothetical study in which participants in a positive mood, the green, scored higher on memory tasks than participants in a negative mood, okay? As you can see in the green, the positive mood, participants scored a 14 on memory performance, whereas those in a negative mood scored about a 9 on memory performance. Good? So some takeaways quickly before we move on to the second section of our text. Okay, let's just do a little bit of review. An experiment is a type of empirical study that features the manipulation of an independent variable, the measure of a dependent variable, and control of extraneous variables. Studies are high in internal validity to the extent that the way they are conducted supports the conclusion that the independent variable caused any observed difference in the dependent variable. Experiments are generally high in internal validity because of the manipulation of the independent variable and control of extraneous variables. Studies are high in external validity to the extent that the results can be generalized to people and situations beyond those actually studied. Although experiments can seem artificial and low in external validity, it is important to consider whether the psychological processes under study are likely to operate in other people and in other situations, okay? Now let's move on to our second section, which is experimental design. In this section, Paul Price is going to explain the difference between subjects and within subject experiments. He's going to list some of the pros and cons of each approach and decide which approach to use to answer a particular research question. He's also going to define and show us how to define a random assignment, distinguish it from random sampling, and explain its purpose in experimental research and use some simple strategies to implement it. We should be able to define what a control condition is, explain its purpose in research on treatment effectiveness, and describe some alternative types of control conditions. And lastly, define several types of carryover effect and give examples of each and explain how counterbalancing helps to deal with them, okay? So let's move on to experimental design, okay? In a between subject experiment, each participant is tested in only one condition, okay? It is essential in a between subjects experiment that the researcher assigns participants to conditions so that the different groups are, on average, highly similar to one another, to each other. The primary way that a researcher accomplishes this kind of control of extraneous variables across conditions is called random assignment, which means using a random process to decide which participants are tested in which conditions, okay? Again, going over some terms that were covered in chapter 1 and chapter 2. Random sampling is a method for selecting a sample from a population, and it is rarely used in psychological research. Okay. A random assignment is a method for assigning participants in a sample to different conditions, and it is an important element of all experimental research in psychology and in other fields as well. A random assignment needs to meet two specific criteria. The first one is that each participant has an equal choice of being assigned to each condition. The second one is that each participant is assigned to a condition independent of the other participants. Okay. It is a standard practice to use a kind of modified random assignment that keeps the number of participants in each group as similar as possible. One approach, okay, is block randomization, okay? Block randomization is a method of randomly assigning participants that guarantees that the condition sample sizes are equal or at least almost equal, okay? In a block randomization, all the conditions occur once in the sequence before any of them is repeated. Within each of these blocks, the conditions occur in random order. Okay, so we're actually going to refer to table 6.2. Okay. Here is a table of block randomization sequence for assigning 9 participants to 3 conditions. Pause here. Again, table 6.2 shows such a sequence for assigning 9 participants to 3 conditions. Our author used the researcher randomizer website, which generated a block randomization sequence for the number of participants here. Again, when the procedure is computerized, the computer program often handles the block randomization. Okay. Treatment and control conditions. A treatment is an intervention intended to change people's behavior for the better. This includes psychotherapies and medical treatments for psychological disorders, but also interventions designed to improve learning, promote conservation, reduce prejudice, and so on. To determine whether a treatment works, participants are randomly assigned to either a treatment condition in which they receive treatment or a control condition in which they do not receive a treatment. Okay. In research, one of the effectiveness of psychotherapies and medical treatment is this type of experiment is often called randomized clinical trials, okay? Spontaneous remission refers to the tendency of many psychological and medical problems to get better with the passage of time. There are different types of control conditions though, okay? One is the no treatment control condition, where participants receive no treatment whatsoever, okay? Okay, I just had to put on a sweater just because it got cold. But again, just a quick recap. There are different types of control conditions. Again, we went over the no treatment control condition, which is a control condition in which participants receive no treatment whatsoever, not even a placebo, okay? One problem with this approach is the existence of a placebo effect or placebo effects. For those of you who do not recall, the definitions are right here. A placebo is a treatment that lacks any active ingredient or effect or element that should make it effective. A placebo effect is the positive effect of a placebo, okay? So placebos pose a serious problem for researchers who want to determine whether or not the treatment works. Another type of control condition is a placebo control condition and a weightless control condition. However, there is a figure on our next slide, figure 6.2, which is a hypothetical result from a study including treatment, no treatment, and placebo conditions. You can find this figure on page 107 in your textbook, the newer edition of the textbook. However, let me read a little blurb from our textbook. When participants in a treatment condition take a pill, for example, then those in a placebo control condition would take an identical looking pill that lacks the active ingredient in the treatment. So they're taking a sugar pill. In research on psychotherapy effectiveness, the placebo might involve going to a psychotherapist and talking in an unstructured way about one's problems. The idea is that if participants in both the treatment and the placebo groups expect to improve, then any improvement in the treatment group over and above that in the placebo control group must have been caused by the treatment and not by the participant's expectation. This is what's actually shown by a comparison of the two outer bars on our figure. The treatment in the light blue or the baby blue, and then the placebo in the red, okay? So again, you can find this figure on page 107 in your textbook. So take a moment to pause and look at this figure. Now let's go over the last two types of control conditions, okay? The second one is the placebo control condition, which participants receive a placebo that looks much like the treatment, but it lacks the active ingredient or element thought to be responsible for the treatment's effectiveness. And then the last type of control condition is a weightless control condition, okay? Where participants are told that they will receive the treatment, but they must wait until participants in the treatment condition have already received it, or once the study has been completed with those individuals, okay? Within subject experiments, okay? In a within subjects experiment, each participant is tested under all conditions, okay? The primary advantage of this approach is that it provides maximum control of extraneous variables. Okay, but I also want you to consider an example, and you can find this example in your book as well when you go to the specific section talking about within subject experiments. But I want you guys to consider an experiment on the effect of a defendant's physical attractiveness on judgment of his or her guilt, okay? And then go back, so keep that in mind, and then go back to our definition of a within subjects experiment and see how that would work, okay? So again, the primary advantage of this approach, a within subjects experiment, is that it provides maximum control of extraneous participants' variables, okay? The primary disadvantage of a within subjects design is that they can result in carryover effects. A carryover effect is an effect of being tested in one condition on participants' behavior in later conditions, okay? There are several types of carryover effect. There is a practice effect, a fatigue effect, and a context effect. A practice effect is where participants perform a task better in later conditions because they've had a chance to actually practice it. A fatigue effect is a carryover effect in which participants perform worse on a task in later conditions because they've become tired or bored. And then our context effect is a carryover effect in which being in one condition affects how participants perceive or interpret the task at hand or their task. Okay. Carryover effects can be problematic when they are not the focus of the research. Okay. The solution to the problem of a carryover effect is counterbalancing. Counterbalancing, which means testing different participants in different orders. Okay. Two ways to think about counterbalancing and what it accomplishes is that it controls the order of the condition so that it is no longer a confounding variable. And the second is if there are carryover effects, it makes it possible to actually detect them. Okay. So between subjects or within subjects, again, this is just the pros and the cons of those. So please take a pause at these slides and just kind of look at them. Okay, using one type of design does not preclude using the other in a separate study. There is no reason that a researcher could not use both between and within subject designs to answer the same research question. Okay, so some of the takeaway points in this specific section of chapter 6, experiments can be conducted using between subjects or within subject designs. Deciding which in a particular situation requires careful consideration of the pros and cons of each. So go back 2 slides and you can see the pros and cons of each. Random assignments to conditions in between subject experiments or to orders of conditions in within subject experiments is a fundamental element of experimental research. Its purpose is to control extraneous variables so that they do not become confounding variables. Experimental research on the effectiveness of a treatment requires both a treatment condition and a control condition, which can be a no treatment control condition, a placebo control condition, or a waitlist control condition. Experimental treatments can also be compared to the best available alternative out there. Our last section is on conducting experiments. Okay? In this last and final section, Paul Price is going to describe several strategies for recruiting participants for an experiment. He's going to explain why it's important to standardize the procedure of an experiment and several ways that we can actually do this in our own projects, in our own studies. Lastly, he's going to explain what pilot testing is and why it's important to pilot test. So let's begin. When it comes time to conduct an experiment, there are several additional practical issues that arise. Much of this information applies to non-experimental studies as well as experimental ones. There are many ways to recruit participants. One of the most common ways is to recruit participants from a formal subject pool, okay? A formal subject pool, is an established group of people who have agreed to be contacted about participating in future research studies. My mom and my dad are actually part of a formal subject pool. My dad actually is going through the process of prostate cancer, and my mom has had several heart attacks. So, and they have tried everything that you could think of in regards to beating and fighting and curing the conditions that they have. However, there's only so much that is out there. So when they do have experimental drugs and things like that, my parents are some of the first that are contacted to try them out. Again, free of charge, but it comes down to like, there are quite a few people who partake in these formal subject pools because it's the last things that they can actually do. So this is a great way to recruit participants. You can also recruit participants through advertisements and also personal appeals. Okay. Continuing on with conducting experiments. It's important to standardize the procedure to minimize extraneous and confounding variables. One important source of such variation is the experimenter's expectations of how participants should behave in the experiment. This is referred to as an experimenter's expectancy effect. Okay, so an experimenter's expectancy effect is an unintended effect of the experimenter's expectations on the result of the study, in which the results are consistent with those expectations. There are several ways to minimize unintended variation in most research procedures. Okay. One of those ways is to create a written protocol that specifies everything that the experimenters are to do and say from the time they greet the participant to the time that they dismiss them. In general, this should be even more detailed in the IRB. So the IRB, go back to, I believe, chapter 3 or chapter 4. Okay. And just a second. Okay. You can also create standard instructions that participants read themselves, or they're read word for word by the experimenter. Consider recording the instructions and playing the same recording for all participants. You can automate the rest of the procedure as much as possible. Many software packages create computerized psychology experiments. Even a simple computer slideshow can help standardize stimulus presentation. You can also, again, we are just going over the ways to minimize unintended variation, okay, to standardize the procedure. You can train multiple experimenters on the protocol together, have them practice the procedure on each other and evaluate each other's consistency with the protocol. You can be sure that the experimenters test participants in all conditions. For example, avoid having one experimenter test participants in one condition and another experimenter test participants on another condition. Another good practice is to arrange the experimenters to be blind to the research question on the condition that each participant is tested in. The idea is to minimize the experimenter's expectancy effect by minimizing the experimenter's expectation. So arrange the experimenters to be blind to the research question or to the condition that each participant is tested in. Okay. Because, again, one of the reasons that we're doing this is because both participants and the experimenters are blind to the condition. This is referred to as a double-blind study. Okay. It is essential to keep good records when you conduct an experiment, and it's typical for experimenters to generate a written sequence of conditions before they actually conduct the study. This kind of information can be useful later if you decide to analyze sex differences or experimenters' effects, or if a question arises about a particular participant or testing question. It can also be useful to design an identification number to each participant so that they remain anonymous. It is always good, and it's always a good idea for you to conduct a pilot test of your experiment. A pilot test is a small-scale study conducted to make sure that a new procedure works as planned. In a pilot test, you can recruit participants formally. So for example, you can recruit participants from an established participant pool, or you can recruit them informally from among family, friends, classmates, and so on, okay? So quickly, just some takeaway points. There are several effective methods that you can use to recruit research participants in your experiments, including through formal subject pools, advertisement, and personal appeals through word of mouth. Field experiments require a well-defined participant selection procedure as well. It is important to standardize experimental procedures to minimize extraneous variables, including experimenter expectancy effects. And lastly, it's important to conduct one or more small-scale pilots of an experiment to be sure that your procedure actually works as planned, okay? So again, this is chapter 6. Chapter 6 is on experimental research. after reading this chapter or after watching this recording, please sit back and just think about your research question, your research project. Could experimental research be a method that you use in your method section of your proposal? Okay, so I'll see you guys later. Have a good one.